Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we'll talk about projection. Projection is a fundamental concept within the psychology of Carl Jung. It is fundamental because for Jung, as we'll see towards the end of the video, projection forms the fundament of our interaction with reality and at the same time functions as a chance to further the process of individuation, which for Jung is sort of the process of developing a more authentic, truer self and touching upon the sort of, let's say, objective nature of the psyche or of what we are. Thanks for joining this video today. If you're new to the channel, do consider to subscribe, and in any case, please leave your comment below and tell me what you think of this video and other topics you may want to hear on the channel so we can make content that really fits your desires, so to speak. The video will be split into a few parts. First, we'll work towards a definition of projection. So what precisely do we think projection means? We'll then talk about the problem of the archetypes in projection. So that means the archetypes as part of the collective unconscious play an important role in the process of projection. Whereas for, let's say, the example, the Freudian perspective is limited to the personal unconscious and the projection of, as we'll see, repressed contents. We'll then talk about projection as the fundament of reality within the Jungian framework, and then finally talk about projection as a chance, so as a possibility of learning more about ourselves. Just a very brief recap. So Carl Jung, psychoanalyst. Carl Jung is a Swiss psychoanalyst who has been working at the turn of the century, from the 19th to 20th century. He was a student of Freud. Freud as sort of the father of the psychoanalytic technique as a therapeutic intervention. While he's not the inventor of the unconscious, he did do substantial work on developing theories of the unconscious. And Jung, as a student, went beyond or further than Freud, developing concepts that are now sort of hallmark concepts in the psychodynamic theories of the subject. Such as the collective unconscious, the archetypes, and others. Projection in this context plays an important role. Projection for Jung, as he says, is one of the commonest psychic phenomena. This is a quote. Projection is one of the commonest psychic phenomena. Everything that is unconscious in ourselves, we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly. Now, this is the level of the personal unconscious that Jung touches upon here, although, as we'll see in a bit, he already interludes in this brief sentence also the collective level of projection. But essentially, at a very fundamental level, projection is that which we have. Projection occurs when something within ourselves is recognized somewhere in what we call the external world. We may say a neighbor that we see as someone who is enigmatic, like unknown, we don't really know much about them, and we'll say, well, I'm sure he looks very suspicious, he's probably keeping a lot of dark secrets in his basement, something like that. And what we project outward here may be an inner psychic, either a fear, let's stay on the personal level for a minute, either a fear within us of a certain type of person, maybe even and this would be a Freudian perspective, a repressed desire, a repressed memory, something within ourselves that we carry outward. Now, the personal unconscious, obviously, for Jung, is the level of the ego which is sort of not explicated. So if you think about the ego as a narrative, then the unconscious may be thought of as the gaps within that narrative, as well as those elements below the narrative elements that you have sort of assembled in this linear structure that I always reference in the ego, that sort of pull the threads and determine what these linear structures are, is actually understood as. So the unconscious is that which you cannot willfully recall at any point in time for Jung. Now, Freud writes, projection helps to reduce anxiety by allowing the expression of unwanted unconscious impulses or desires without letting the conscious mind recognize them. Now, what is sort of a precursor to that is that Freud basically sees projection as a defense mechanism. So defense mechanism basically means that the ego in the process of constructing this linear narrative that I just mentioned is attempting to protect itself from the influence of contents that may shatter or may rupture, as I say, precisely this narrative. So the ego's function is essentially stability. The ego is building stability for the psyche to exist sort of towards the future, right? And what I mean by that is sort of the stability that we need to move and navigate within a social context, within the context of the societies that we live in. And that includes sort of the natural context that we exist in, the environment, if we will. In order to achieve that, we need a stable starting point. A starting point that is essentially determined by an ego that can be used as a center with which we navigate. And this center is the interpretive framework for everything we encounter. So if we encounter, for example, something violent, something that may otherwise rupture or be threatening to the stability of our self-understanding, the ego often attempts to sort of interpret it away, right? And that would be what we would refer to some extent as repression, right? The ego is going to say, oh well, this thing that I did, you know, this violent outbreak that I had towards my neighbor, this was actually, it was just because I was tired. You know, maybe I had a little drink too, so it was that, you know. And we don't try to see precisely what actually causes this action, which is sort of the fact that the narration that we build about ourselves is flawed. It has gaps, and those gaps are precisely where violence can arise. Because within us, we are not only this happy person, but there's elements of, let's say in this example, violence within us. And so Freud says that projection essentially helps reduce the anxiety that the awareness of all of this sort of negative, in quotation marks, contents within the psyche, within the ego would cause by simply projecting it or sort of displacing it to another person or another entity. Now, Jung says, however, that the unconscious then forces its aims upon us or upon others against our will. And this is what we mean by projection. So Jung, we already see, has quite a different perspective on projection here than Freud. So for Freud, projection is almost a good thing, you may say, although he brings it in the context of religion again, where he says basically our religious concepts or religious practices are driven by projection. Jung says, however, that consciousness or the unconscious has sort of its own plan, its own aim, right? And this is pretty particular to the Jungian quest, and this will gets us into the discussion of the archetypes in this moment, right? For Jung, the unconscious is not only limited to the personal unconscious that we've discussed a bit now in this first section of the video, but the unconscious also spreads to a collective component. And essentially the collective component, the archetypes, are a shared topography that all subjects, everyone participating in sort of the psychic quest, if you will, or the psychic everyone that essentially has a psyche, claims to have a psyche, which is sort of arising at the intersection of an environment that you need to navigate and the attempt to navigate this environment, or the navigating instance, essentially has certain trajectories that guide this navigation, right? And if you want to know more about my understanding of the archetypes, which is again largely derived from Jung, also adding some of my own interpretation or some of Jung's successors' interpretations, then do look at other videos. I may post some in the description below, or you can find some on the channel. And by the way, if you like this video, then I'd really appreciate a like, a thumbs up, and obviously subscribe to the channel. That'd be very helpful for you and for me, I think. So essentially the archetypes are, as we would say, the drivers of projection in the Jungian view. Why? Because for Jung, psychic energy essentially arises in the constellation of an archetype. So if you're in a given moment where, let's say, you're in an interaction with someone who constellates a mother, let's say, constellates the activation of the mother archetype, then in this precise moment, psychic energy will browse from this mother archetype, so from the core of the complex around which sort of content pertaining to this mother archetype is clustered, and the energy sort of spreads outwardly into this content that is then on the personal level. So essentially, the mother archetype, or the archetypes in general, sit at the core of what Jung refers to as complexes. And those complexes are where basically content from the personal unconscious can be clustered. Now, the whole idea here is, if I talked about trajectories earlier, that these cores function as the sort of the trajectories, or I always think of it as shelves within which books can be clustered. And essentially those shelves are filled with content that you experience in your own life. And the core, again, is this archetypal core that is simply sort of active, or sort of, it's a spectrum, it's more active or less active, and provides energy that activates then basically the surrounding contents. And alongside this content, of course, is content that you've previously encountered that is let's say, more archetypal in the common sense, as in archetypal products of the psyche. That would include symbols, and those encounters can be by proxy, so by you directly, or by some of them are arguably sort of naturally endowed with archetypal energy, I would say. But basically, projection of the archetype arises in a moment where it's constellated. So if we return to this neighbor example, and this neighbor that you were afraid of or projected some kind of violent tendencies on, then essentially the archetype of the shadow, or what you have repressed in your shadow, would become activated via the sort of the constellation, and therefore the activation of psychic energy in the archetype of the shadow, because this content has been clustered around that. For instance, right? That's an example. Now, what is very important is that for Jung, essentially, because reality is essentially structured archetypally, projection functions as the fundament of all of reality. Jung says that we must bear in mind that every activation of the unconscious causes some kind of projection to be perceived outside of the self, but that we can never be sure that the actual object is exactly what we think it is. He says this in the Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. And essentially, you must be aware that every activation of the unconscious is essentially the unconscious is always active. It's never not active, right? Even in the process of thinking. And essentially, this is why on the first level, right, if we move away from some metaphysical interventions here for a moment, every action you take is possibly based on projection. So even if I say, well, let's say I have a meeting for a job that I'm doing, even if it's a very serious corporate job, and I'm interacting with someone in a certain way, this someone will have activated on some level some kind of archetype, multiple types of archetypes at the same time, usually, that are constellated, and thus provide energy for consciousness to act in a certain way. That's the very fundament of psychic energy, right? Unless you feel completely withdrawn and unenergetic, so you're in a state of depression, you'll always have sort of an activation of some kind of archetype in that moment. And this is the first reason, obviously, why there's always an activation or always a projection going on, right? And it prompts us to very carefully look at, and we'll talk about this in the last section of the video a bit more, but very carefully look at our actions and reactions, because they reveal something very critical about the unconscious structures that we're endowed with, let's say. The second level, however, and the main reason why projection is the fundament of reality, is sort of derived from the metaphysical structures of the Jungian quest, which is the idea, again, as I interluded here, that the archetypes underlie not only psychic reality, but also physical reality. So that this sort of dual aspect monism perspective, which I have gone into in other videos in depth. I won't go in depth on this now, but you can check out the other videos in the description, or you can find them on the channel. Again, the reminder, please do leave a like and comment if you want to hear more on this topic. The idea here, very shortly, very briefly, is that basically, because the archetypes have been structured in a time where consciousness hasn't been as active, as strong as now, the archetypes have been structured in this time in an interaction with the environment that we were manifested in, let's say. And precisely because of that, they arise at the intersection of these two sort of strings of manifestation, let's say. And the reason here then why projection basically plays a role is because the archetypes are always present, right? We are always, so there's always a level of activation within the interaction that we have with the environment, even if it's simply witnessing, even if it's a non-action, right, in that sense. Now, why then is projection a chance, right? So the final sort of chapter. Projection is a chance because, as I said, on the one hand, it is essentially shifting the world into a replica of one's own unknown face. This is what Jung says. Jung says projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. He says it's an ion. What this means now essentially is that we can witness ourselves sort of externalized within the environment, always present within the actions and reactions we take. And again, our reactions, it's this infinite sort of interaction, right? Something happens because I do something, right? Because I am one with this world, essentially, by way of this connection in this sort of deep layer of the unconscious, the archetypal layer. My actions cause something within the environment, and the actions of the environment cause something within me. And then via this mechanism of projection, again, I can witness myself sort of acting and reacting within the environment. So if I say my neighbor is XYZ, what I'm actually saying in a way is I am XYZ, right? This is especially true, right? If we say, we often say, well, Peter, he's such a great guy, he's, and we, basically what's going on here probably is sort of this idea that I wish to be that as well, right? And you can, if you go through the world carefully, you see that people make these kinds of claims and statements all the time. It's like, oh yeah, it's not like I want XYZ, but like, you actually want, that's exactly what you want, This is a very, very interesting discussion also in the context of taking people's word for granted. If we learned one thing from psychoanalysis is that what someone says is never what they mean. Because it's just on multiple levels, and this is true in Jungian psychoanalysis and most interestingly, I guess, also in Freudian Lacanian psychoanalysis, right? So I think the call here that Jung has is really observe the world carefully. Look at how the world reacts to you and how you react to the world. And that'll tell you a lot about your own sort of psychological makeup. I think that's the bottom line message of this video as well. So as a conclusion, thanks a lot for watching. And again, I think my main message and the main quest also of this channel is to prompt people to realize that the world as it presents itself to us bears a lot of what we present to the world or what we bring to the world. It's a reflection of ourselves on multiple levels, right? And projection is one level on which you can see it as a reflection. That's why I think it's a very important concept and a key concept. Thanks for watching. Again, leave your comment in the comment section below. I'll be curious to hear what you think. And again, don't forget to subscribe.